The middle of the 16th century was an auspicious time for the Medici family of Florence. In 1537, Cosimo de' Medici ascended as second Duke of Florence. Later in his reign, he would adopt the grander title of Grand Duke of Tuscany. His accession in 1537 came only a few years after the end of the papacy of his cousin, Pope Clement VII. Clement's time as head of the Roman Catholic Church had followed very soon after that of another Medici Pope, Leo X, Bishop of Rome, from 1513 to 1521. Meanwhile, 4 years before Cosimo became Duke of Florence, another Medici, Catherine, had married Prince Henry of France. Henry became King of France in 1547, meaning that Catherine de' Medici was now Queen Consort of one of Europe's great kingdoms. 3 of her sons would rule France. Another Medici was the mother of the Bourbon dynasty, the royal family of France during the 17th and 18th centuries. Dukes, popes, queens, kings. This was the status of the House of Medici in the 16th century. And yet, the strange thing is that in many ways the peak of this immensely important family had actually come in the 15th century, when the House of Medici patronized the Renaissance in the city of Florence. Few dynasties have had such a bearing on history. This is the story of the Medicis of Florence, from their humble origins to their rise as one of the most powerful families in the world. The Medici family traced their origins to Carfaggiolo, in Tuscany in north-central Italy. This was an agricultural community lying about 20 kilometers north of the city of Florence. The name Medici is interesting. The High Middle Ages was the period in Europe's history when surnames began to become widely used. Prior to this, people had a Christian first name and generally were associated with where they lived. So, for instance, a person might be called Tommaso of Milan or Jean of Paris. In the 12th and 13th centuries, occupational surnames emerged, which describe somebody's profession. Medici, as seems fairly clear from the word, derives from medico or medici, meaning a medic. This suggests that an early member of the family was a healer or doctor of some kind, though no evidence of who this might have been has ever been found. In any event, medical knowledge was so limited at the time that any family medic would have been a practitioner of folk medicine rather than scientific medicine. More broadly, the family were clearly of peasant stock originally. However, they were evidently prospering, and by the dawn of the 14th century, they had enough money to begin loaning some of it at interest. This occurred just as the Republic of Florence, one of Italy's many small city-states, was beginning to emerge as the foremost commercial and trading center in Tuscany, eclipsing its main rivals, the cities of Pisa and Siena. The Medici would soon become one of the city's great banking families. The Medici family's rise to power occurred in a time and place that was both brilliant and brutal. The High Middle Ages, the period of history running roughly between the years of 1000 and 1300, was an era in which European society was developing greatly from an economic, political, and cultural standpoint. Italy was one of the core regions involved in this progress, largely because of its powerful trading cities like Venice, Florence, Genoa, and Pisa, each of which carried on a major trade around the Mediterranean Sea. Governments here were becoming more powerful and efficient. Literacy levels were growing in the cities and towns, and universities were starting to appear in places like Bologna and Pisa, while the first major pieces of Renaissance literature were also being written, notably the Florentine Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century. Painters like Giotto were also starting to revolutionize European art. Soon, the first humanist scholars of the New Age would begin fanning out around Europe to search for the lost writings of the Greeks and Romans in the continent's monastic libraries. Yet, at the same time, Italy could be a brutish place. The peninsula was divided into dozens of city-states, the foremost of which were the Papal State that controlled much of central Italy, Naples in the south, and republics like Florence, Genoa, Venice, and Milan in the north. The politics of these places was becoming increasingly violent. Military mercenaries known as condottieri claimed power in places like Milan, and the city-states waged war on one another for land and power. Overshadowing all of this was a terrible famine that ravaged Europe between 1315 and 1317, followed by the advent of the bubonic plague, the Black Death 30 years later. It was against this backdrop of violence and death, living right alongside cultural renewal and vitality, that the Medici would rise to power in Florence. The first members of the Medici family that we know about appear in the first half of the 14th century. By then, several members of the family had moved to Florence and were involved in the banking sector there. Italian banking was innovative in the High Middle Ages, with banks emerging in the city-states that loaned out money to merchants and facilitated long-distance trade using credit notes and connections with bankers in other cities. Averardo de' Medici was one such Medici banker of the period. It is evident that he was prosperous by the 1350s, though the family still did not have the kind of wealth it would create in the 15th century. In late medieval Florence, banking wealth of this kind translated into an ability to become involved in the city's politics, and it isn't surprising that another member of the wider Medici family, Salvestro, served as the gonfaloniere in Florence. This was a post as head of the Republic's council, similar to a mayor of the city-state for a year. He was implicated in a controversial struggle between the wealthier citizens of Florence and the tradespeople, known as the Ciompi Revolt, which began in 1378 and dragged on for several years in the early 1380s. It's noteworthy that by the last quarter of the 14th century, the Medici family, despite their background as a rural peasant family over a century earlier, felt they had more in common with Florence's wealthiest citizens than the middle and poorer classes. As Salvestro was mired in the Ciompi Revolt, a cousin of his, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, was entering his adult years. He was one of the sons of Averardo de' Medici. His father had died before his time and left each of his sons a portion of his wealth and banking business. Though Giovanni did not receive much of this split inheritance, he was the one who would go on to accomplish great things. Over the next several decades, he shrewdly built up his business and also amalgamated other branches of the family's financial dealings under his control. In this way, rather than the Medici being an extended family that had several members working in the loaning out of money, a discernible Medici bank began to emerge in Florence. Giovanni expanded it exponentially in the 1390s, 1400s, and 1410s. It was a period in which there was no shortage of opportunities to make money, as the Italian city-states were mired in conflict and the split within the papacy that had seen a rival pope established in Avignon in southern France was also underway. Giovanni made money lending out capital to various parties involved in these events. Trade was also flourishing again after the fallow years during and after the Black Death. By the time he died in 1429, he had already built the Medici Bank into one of the foremost financial institutions in Italy. The business was ultimately handed over to his son, Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo is remembered today as the great patriarch of the Medici family and its patronage of the Renaissance in Florence and Tuscany. But he stood on the shoulders of his father, who had done so much of the heavy lifting when it came to establishing the family's immense wealth. Cosimo de' Medici was born on the 27th of September 1389 in Florence. By the 1410s, he was heavily involved in his father's business. For instance, he attended the Council of Constance in 1415, a major ecclesiastical and political council of the time that was held near the modern-day Swiss-German border. It was intended to adjudicate on the papal schism between rival popes at Rome and in France. The Medici Bank had formed ties to the papal claimant, Pope John XXIII. However, at Constance, the wider Catholic world rejected his claim. It's a sign of how central Cosimo already was to the operations of the Medici Bank that he was sent to Constance. By the 1420s, he was taking over the family business from his father, who died in 1429. Thereafter, Cosimo combined his financial affairs with a rise within Florence's politics and used his growing political power to leverage his banking business upwards. Unlike other major families around Italy, such as the Visconti family of Milan, Cosimo did not try to establish himself as a de facto aristocratic ruler or Duke of Florence. He left the Republican government in place and instead tried to control it by supporting family members and allies to gain election to senior positions and to dominate the signoria of the city, a council of 9 individuals elected from the members of the city's powerful guilds of craftsmen, bankers, and merchants. In this way, Cosimo became highly influential without directly ruling Florence. At the same time, he did not have everything his own way, and rival Florentine banking and merchant families like the Palestrozzi, Albizzi, and Pazzi families formed an anti-Medici faction that attempted to resist Cosimo's growing dominance of the Republic. Cosimo was more than just a power-hungry banker and political boss. He was a cultured man and a visionary. During his time as the head of the Medici Bank and as the emerging unofficial first citizen of Florence, he sponsored the artistic and cultural development of his native city in ways which would resonate around Italy and then Europe. There were a lot of precedents for this. We have already seen how Florence and the Tuscany region had developed as the birthplace of the Renaissance. Dante wrote the Divine Comedy here. Both Francesco Petrarch and Giovanni Boccaccio were Tuscans and are considered, along with Dante, as being the 3 writers who started the literary Renaissance during the 14th century. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, a collection of short stories similar to Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, while Petrarch, more than anybody else, established the nature of Italian humanism, the new approach to scholarship which focused on rediscovering Greek and Latin texts. By the time Cosimo was born, the artistic and literary renaissances were expanding in Florence, and a new generation of artists like Lorenzo Ghiberti were gaining note in the city. Cosimo's father was a patron of this work. He sponsored Ghiberti and was influential in ensuring that he was selected to produce the ornate bronze doors which adorn the baptistry in the city centre. Giovanni also played a role in the decision to place Filippo Brunelleschi in charge of developing the immense dome that was to be built on top of the Cathedral of Florence. It should be noted, though, that the Medici family did not bankroll the cathedral project. It was a civic project undertaken by the Florentine people as a whole. Cosimo followed in his father's footsteps when it came to patronizing the arts. Although he employed several dozen artists, sculptors, and architects on various projects, 2 in particular stand out. Michelangelo and Donatello. Michelangelo was hired by Cosimo to design the Palazzo Medici, a fine urban palace that was constructed over nearly 40 years in the center of the city and which acted as an inspiration for many other palazzos around Italy in centuries to come. Donatello produced numerous works for the Medici family, but the most well-known was his bronze statue of the Israelite King David. There is no record of Cosimo actually commissioning Donatello to produce it. However, he must have done so, as the statue ended up standing in the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici not long after it was completed. It was artistically significant as being the first freestanding nude statue produced since the time of the Roman Empire. Nudity had been frowned on in medieval times for religious reasons, and sculptures were generally set into walls rather than being freestanding. Cosimo also financed numerous humanist scholars to travel around Europe to look for manuscripts of lost Greek and Roman books in monastic libraries and other institutions, or to travel to Constantinople, the capital of the ailing Byzantine Empire, to acquire such texts in Greek there. Humanist scholars who were encouraged in such work and who were supported to one degree or another by Cosimo included Niccolò di Niccoli, Leonardo Bruni, and Poggio Bracciolini. We are all indebted to his patronage. While working as a scribe and scholar for Cosimo, Niccoli developed a new form of calligraphic writing that made it easier to read text written by hand. It's called italics today and appears on every word processor. Cosimo was briefly exiled from Florence in 1433 after the anti-Medici faction within the city managed to convince their fellow citizens that he was becoming too powerful and posed a threat to the Republic. His banishment did not last long, and he returned in 1434 after he used his own allies to have the vote overturned. 5 years later, he oversaw a great political and cultural council in the city, which demonstrated his rise as an immensely wealthy and powerful banker, and also his position as one of Europe's most cultured figures. For centuries, there had been a great schism between the Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Greek Orthodox Church, governed from Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This was over various theological and political issues. By the 15th century, it was imperative that the Great Schism should be healed so that the Western Church could come to the aid of the Byzantine Empire, which was under threat from the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Councils had been held in both Florence and Ferrara in Italy through the 1430s to try and accomplish this. Cosimo managed to broker a return to Florence in 1439, where a major breakthrough was made in ending the Great Schism, bolstering Cosimo's reputation throughout Europe. Ultimately, the agreements reached at Florence in 1439 were rejected by the heads of the Greek Church back in Constantinople, and their city fell to the Ottomans in 1453. However, the Council of Florence in 1439 was important in more ways than one. The Greek entourage included leading scholars of the day, like Gemistos Plethon and Bessarion. These men reintroduced new elements of Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy to Florence in 1439. In time, Cosimo financed the establishment of a Platonic academy in the city to further the study of these ancient schools of Greek philosophy. A question arises here. Just how wealthy was Cosimo de' Medici, given that he was able to patronize dozens of artists and scholars, establish schools, and preside over major international conferences to reconcile the Western and Eastern churches? A statement by his grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, gives an indication of exactly how much the family expended alone on its patronage of the arts, Florentine building projects, the maintenance of teams of scholars, and the establishment of the Platonic Academy. He claimed that the sum was around 600,000 florins for the period between 1434 and the start of the 1470s, when Lorenzo had taken over the banking business. Adjusting for inflation and equating for the tricky issue of currency equivalencies, financial historians argue that this is equivalent to slightly more than $500 million in today's money. And that was just their spending on the arts. It's hard to get a sense of their overall wealth, especially so because it fluctuated over time. What's clear is that the bank expanded well beyond Italy under Cosimo's leadership. By the 1440s, for instance, it had a number of major branches north of the Alps, in cities like Lyon, Geneva and Bruges. The Bruges branch was especially important as it allowed the Medici to become involved in the highly lucrative textile trade in the Low Countries. The family even had a branch in London and loaned out money to various groups to fight in the Wars of the Roses during the 1450s and 1460s, though this was ultimately an overreach and the branch was closed in the 1470s. It was not just banking either. The Medici branched out into other economic activities, notably by developing a stake in the lucrative alum mining industry, alum being a substance that was used for the dyeing of cloth. Cosimo de' Medici died at 74 years of age in 1464. He was succeeded by his son Piero, but he was an ill man who suffered from gout and was often bedridden. He died at 53 years of age in 1469, just 5 years after his father. From a purely strategic perspective, the succession of Cosimo's grandson Lorenzo was very fortuitous. Piero's 5 years in charge of the bank had not been great ones. He had been excessive in calling in large loans, causing long-term borrowers to default. Lorenzo was shrewder and cut from the same cloth as his grandfather. Over time, he became known as Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent. He was born on the 1st of January 1449 and was quite a young man when he succeeded his father as head of the bank and family. Over the next 20 years, he led the Medici through a period when they shifted from being predominantly a banking family, acquiring political power within the Republic of Florence, to become a major player in the power politics of Italy as a whole, forming alliances with popes and foreign states, and turning on others. Lorenzo was also keenly intelligent, an accomplished writer and poet himself, and a patron of the arts like his grandfather, with excellent taste. What's all the more striking about Lorenzo's accomplishments and the way he earned the name Il Magnifico is that he died very young. From his mid-20s, he was suffering from serious health issues, and he would eventually die at 43 years of age, from what medical historians believe might have been acromegaly, a condition where the body produces too much growth hormone. Lorenzo's patronage of the arts has an almost legendary element to it. It involved artists like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Sandro Botticelli, Domenico Ghirlandaio, and Andrea del Verrocchio, though the degree to which these individuals enjoyed Medici patronage or flourished during Lorenzo's reign is mixed. For instance, Michelangelo was born in 1475, was only 17 years old when Lorenzo died, and would produce his great works in the Sistine Chapel in Rome and elsewhere decades later. But his first years as an apprentice in Florence between 1488 and 1492 were spent under Lorenzo's patronage, and he even lived for a time at the Palazzo Medici after being identified as an artist and scholar of promise. The role of Lorenzo in furthering the work of others is more self-explanatory. He was a great patron of Sandro Botticelli from his youngest years through to his adult career. His two most famous works, The Birth of Venus and La Primavera, were probably commissioned by the Medici family, though this is not entirely certain. Leonardo da Vinci trained in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, who enjoyed the financial support of Lorenzo over many years. Elsewhere, Lorenzo continued his grandfather's support for scholarship in the city. A good example is his continued patronage of Marsilio Ficino. He was central to Cosimo's Platonic Academy that he set up to revive Greek Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy and learning in the city. Lorenzo maintained his faith in him, and Ficino produced a number of very important books in the 1470s and 1480s under Medici patronage. These are just a sample of the more prominent artists, sculptors, and scholars that enjoyed Medici patronage during Lorenzo's time as head of the family. What's all the more remarkable is that this was occurring in a city that had a population of probably only around 50,000 people at the time. As formidable as Lorenzo's patronage of the arts was, his efforts to solidify his position as the unquestioned first citizen of Florence met with resistance from time to time. In 1478, he faced a grave threat. The House of Medici had many enemies within Florence from amongst the weaker banking and political families of the city. They were fearful of moving against the Medici, though, wary of how the Florentines had tried to oust Cosimo back in 1433, only for him to return from exile a year later, stronger than ever. In the mid-1470s, a number of Lorenzo's enemies, led by Francesco and Jacopo Pazzi, forged a loose alliance with Pope Sixtus IV and planned to assassinate Lorenzo. They struck on the morning of the 26th of April, 1478, while Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano were at Sunday Mass in Florence Cathedral. As the Medici brothers prayed, a group of the Pazzis and their henchmen attacked them within what should have been a sacred space where violence was not allowed. Giuliano was killed on the spot. Lorenzo managed to escape, and in the hours that followed, he retaliated. He crushed efforts to launch a revolt through which the Pazzi planned to wrestle control of the city from the Medici. The Pazzis and their accomplices were hunted down and killed. Jacopo Pazzi was eventually tortured and beheaded, his head being set up briefly as a door knocker at the entrance to the Palazzo Pazzi. Although he was excommunicated by the Pope afterwards, Lorenzo's response to the Pazzi conspiracy had demonstrated his ruthlessness in dealing with his enemies. In the long run, it strengthened his position, as he was able to use the plot as a means of getting rid of his enemies from the city and consolidating power more firmly in his hands. After 1478, nobody was in any doubt that Lorenzo de' Medici was the ruler of the city, even if the republican institutions remained in place on the surface. The unofficial rule of the House of Medici over the city of Florence was effective so long as it was led by skilled members of the dynasty. This was what had occurred for a century. Giovanni, Cosimo, and Lorenzo had provided an almost uninterrupted 100 years in which they had greatly expanded the wealth and power of their family. In the process, they had patronized the city's greatest artists and scholars and outflanked enemies like the Pazzi. The problem with such a system is that eventually less capable family members come along. This was the case to an extent with the successors to Lorenzo. They were also unlucky, as events in Italy were about to destabilize the entire peninsula. When he died prematurely in 1492, Lorenzo was succeeded by his son Piero. He immediately faced challenges, as there were other branches of the family that were uneasy after decades of power being centralized in the hands of Cosimo and Lorenzo. The bank's fortunes were also declining, as Lorenzo, for all his greatness, had prioritized spending money above making more of it. Then, another major problem erupted in 1494, as the Italian Wars began. France and Spain were the two most powerful kingdoms in Western Europe in the late 15th century. Both had historic connections to Italy, particularly the south of the peninsula, around Naples, which had been ruled by both French and Spanish royal houses in past times. Thus, when Ferdinand I, the Aragonese king of Naples, died in 1494, the French, under King Charles VIII, invaded Italy to try and secure control over Naples and gain influence across Italy. The Spanish responded militarily. The Italian wars that now began would last for 65 years. In the wars that began with Charles VIII's invasion of Italy in 1494, each of the Italian city-states would have to choose sides, balancing whether allying with the French or Spanish would benefit them. Many changed sides numerous times over the decades as the politics of the wars changed. The conflict also provided opportunities for different factions in certain city-states to try and overthrow their opponents. Indeed, one of the reasons why Charles VIII of France was convinced to commence his invasion of the peninsula in 1494 was to support Ludovico Sforza, who was seeking to claim his cousin Gian Galeazzo Sforza's position as Duke of Milan. In Florence, the invasion of the peninsula by the French also created problems for the Medici. Charles was outmatched from a naval perspective in the Mediterranean by the Spanish and needed to campaign south to Naples. This meant passing through Tuscany and the lands of the papacy in central Italy. Piero consequently had to try and negotiate with the French king. He offered to allow the French forces to pass through his lands and to otherwise remain neutral in the war. Charles considered this unacceptable and demanded an alliance and control over several military forts in Tuscany. Piero had little choice except to agree to this, as Charles's large army was massing on the borders of Tuscany. When he presented the terms to the city council, opposition to the Medici boiled over, fueled by the sermons of Girolamo Savonarola, a radical Dominican friar whose preaching had gained him more and more followers in Florence in the early 1490s. Goaded by Savonarola and angered by Piero's capitulation to Charles, the Medici were driven from the city and the Republican government was fully re-established. The House of Medici had seemingly fallen from power. Following his expulsion from Florence, Piero went into exile, living for a time in the powerful Republic of Venice. The one advantage Piero had was that the circumstances of his expulsion from Florence had earned him the support of the French. For the remainder of his life, until his death in 1503, he tried to reclaim his position in Tuscany with French aid. In the meantime, Florence went through a period of radical politics. Savonarola's power continued to grow. This culminated in the infamous Bonfire of the Vanities in the square of Florence on the night of the 7th of February 1497, when icons and cultural works of all kinds that could be deemed sacrilegious were incinerated. Savonarola did not last much longer himself, and a year later he was killed by the city authorities. In his place, Republican officials like Piero Soderini and Niccolò Machiavelli came to power. Eventually, the diplomatic situation shifted again, and Soderini allied Florence with the French. This caused a new Giovanni de' Medici, a younger son of Lorenzo, who had emerged as the new head of the family in exile following the death of his brother Piero, to ally with the Spanish. Living in Rome, he also acquired the assistance of Pope Julius II. In 1512, with both papal and Spanish assistance, Giovanni managed to initiate a revolt within the government of Florence that allowed for the return to power of the Medici in the city without a bloodbath that might have occurred had he laid siege to the city. After 18 years in exile, the House of Medici were back in control of the home of the Renaissance. Giovanni had led the effort to reclaim power in Florence, but he had little intention of ruling the city-state in the way his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had. Instead, he had eyes on the papacy. Julius II was aged and nearing the end of his life, and Giovanni had forged enough connections in Rome to have a good chance of succeeding him. Thus, he placed his younger brother, Giuliano, in charge of Florence. Pope Julius would indeed die on the 21st of February 1513, and Giovanni would manage to win election to become Pope Leo X in early March, the first of 4 Medici popes in the space of a century. Giuliano's reign within Florence was short. He died in 1516. Regardless, it was obvious from 1512 onwards that he would soon be eclipsed by his much more ambitious nephew, another Lorenzo de' Medici, a son of Piero de' Medici, who had been overthrown in 1494 and died in 1503. He was named after his grandfather, Lorenzo il Magnifico. Lorenzo the Younger was a kind of spiritual successor to his grandfather and namesake, and established himself first as Duke of Urbino, a city-state which the Medici had gained influence over, before also becoming head of the government of Florence in 1516. Significantly, it was to Lorenzo the Younger, not Giuliano, that Machiavelli dedicated The Prince in 1513, in an attempt to rehabilitate himself within the new Medici government in the early 1510s. This notorious political treatise and its author are profoundly misunderstood. Far from being a scheming advocate of duplicity and ruthlessness, Machiavelli was a Republican patriot who counseled Lorenzo, the soon-to-be ruler of Florence, to rule by winning the love of his people where possible. Nearly 2 decades in exile, during which they were trying to win back power in Florence, had changed the position of the Medici considerably. What had initially seemed like an existential threat to their position had actually made them more powerful. In Venice, Rome, and elsewhere, between 1494 and 1512, they had cultivated diplomatic ties that made the family major players in the politics of Western Europe. Thus, from the early 16th century onwards, the story of the House of Medici takes on a more international dimension. Pope Leo X, as the first Medici Pope, was one of the most powerful men in Europe. He is an infamous figure. In order to finance papal projects like the building of St. Peter's Basilica, the centerpiece of what is now the Vatican City, Leo ordered a drastic increase in the sale of papal indulgences, documents the Church sold for the remittance of sins. His actions in ordering a huge escalation in the sale of these in Germany was the spark which led Martin Luther to begin his protestations against the abuses of the papacy and the established Church. Luther's reaction met with an intense amount of support. Before long, an enormous number of people were responding to Luther's message. By the time Leo died in December 1521, Germany was a powder keg of religious tensions which would soon explode. A century and a half of religious wars would follow across Europe, the legacy of the first Medici Pope. The House of Medici would only have to wait 2 years before they reclaimed the Bishopric of Rome. During his time as Pope, Leo had seen to it that one of his cousins, Giulio, was elevated to become Archbishop of Florence and a Cardinal of the Church. Giulio was a son of Giuliano de' Medici, who had been assassinated in Florence Cathedral back in 1478 during the Pazzi conspiracy. Born a month after his father was slain, he had been a relatively obscure member of the family until his cousin rapidly promoted him through the Church in the 1510s. In November 1523, 2 months after the death of Pope Adrian VI, the papal conclave elected Giulio as Pope Clement VII at 45 years of age. His papacy would prove extremely challenging. He had to grapple with the spread of the Protestant Reformation beyond Germany, into places like the Swiss Confederacy. In 1527, Sweden officially began the state conversion to Protestantism, and others like Denmark and England began to drift in that direction in the early 1530s. Much of Clement's time as Pope was spent trying to stop this spread of Protestantism, even as his hands were tied at home. The Italian Wars had entered a new violent phase in the 1520s, and on the 6th of May 1527, mutinous troops of Charles V, King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, sacked Rome. For months thereafter, the city was occupied by the Spanish, who only gradually disengaged as plague ravaged the city. As a virtual prisoner of the Spanish, Clement had his hands tied in negotiations with King Henry VIII, whose failure to acquire papal approval for his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Charles V's aunt, contributed significantly towards driving England into the Protestant camp. Although he was ensconced in Rome and faced many difficulties during his time as Pope, his status as head of the Roman Catholic Church made Clement the de facto head of the House of Medici for over a decade. He died in September 1534, after 11 years as pontiff. This was not before he oversaw a radical transformation of the family. Even after the restoration to power in Florence in 1512, when the family's enemies were completely crushed, the veneer of republican rule in the city had been maintained. A faction in the city had once again attempted to overthrow the Medici in 1527. Eventually, Medici rule was fully re-established in 1530. The head of the family there now was Alessandro de' Medici. His parentage is debated. He was raised as a son of Lorenzo the Younger, but it is generally believed that he was an illegitimate son of Pope Clement. This would certainly fit with Clement's decision to support Alessandro's elevation to become the first Duke of Florence in 1532. After over a century of the Medici being the dominant family of the Republic, the guise of democratic government was dispensed with, and the city's political system was transformed into an aristocratic dukedom controlled by the Medici. Alessandro would only rule for 5 years. In 1537, he was assassinated by a distant cousin and was succeeded by Cosimo the Younger, a son of a member of the family who had become a respected mercenary commander during the Italian Wars. This marked the transition to Florence being ruled by a different branch of the family to that of Lorenzo il Magnifico and the great rulers of the 15th century. This new Cosimo would rule for nearly 4 decades as Duke, even altering his title from Duke of Florence to Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1569. Pope Clement had taken another major step towards transforming his family into royals and aristocrats before his death. In the early 1530s, his young cousin, Catherine de' Medici, a daughter of Lorenzo the Younger, was summoned to Rome. There, Clement began negotiating potential marriage alliances with Europe's royal houses. The match, formed in 1533, when Catherine was just 14 years old, was with Henry, the second oldest son of King Francis I. Only 3 years later, Henry's older brother, Francis, Duke of Brittany, died from what is believed to have been tuberculosis. Thus, what had been viewed as a marriage of this female member of the House of Medici into the French aristocracy had changed quickly to a situation where Catherine would now probably become the Queen Consort of France one day. This is indeed what happened. In 1547, her father-in-law, King Francis I, died, and her husband ascended as King Henry II of France. The mid-16th century was therefore a new era of Medici power. Catherine became Queen Consort of France and had several sons with Henry who would one day rule France as direct members of the Medici family. At the same time, Cosimo the Younger was ruling Florence directly as a dukedom. Finally, in 1559, a third member of the House of Medici, Giovanni Angelo, was elected as the third Medici Pope in less than 50 years. Pope Pius IV belonged to a collateral branch of the family with roots in Milan, but he nevertheless is recognized as a Medici Pope, one who reconvened the Council of Trent, which was overseeing the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation to reform the Church in response to the Protestant Reformation that had started under his distant cousin Leo X's watch back in the late 1510s. Inevitably, given her status as Queen Consort of France, most attention when it comes to the House of Medici during this period has been focused on Catherine de' Medici. Her position as queen became very significant in 1559, when her husband was killed in a freak jousting accident during a competition being held to celebrate the Treaty of Cato Cambresis, which had been agreed to bring the Italian wars to an end after 65 years of intermittent war between France and Spain. With Henry's death at 40 years of age, his and Catherine's eldest son ascended to the throne as King Francis II. He reigned for only a year and a half, dying on the 5th of December 1560 from an ear infection. He was in turn succeeded by his brother, who became King Charles IX. The boy's youth meant that a regency government was established to rule on his behalf until he came of age. Catherine played a major role in the politics of the 1560s and 1570s as a result. This was a highly volatile period in France's history, as the wars of religion between French Catholics and Protestants divided the kingdom and led to regular bouts of violence. Catherine was notoriously central to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in Paris, which began on the night of the 23rd of August 1572, days after the marriage of Catherine's daughter, Margaret, to Henry of Navarre, head of the House of Bourbon. The marriage of the Catholic Margaret to the Protestant Henry had been intended to reconcile the warring factions in France. Instead, it led to a renewed outbreak of war. In this and other ways, Catherine would play an often malevolent role in French politics down to her death in 1589. Catherine died on the 5th of January 1589. By then, 3 of her 4 sons were dead, Charles having died in 1574, and another, Francis, Duke of Anjou and Alençon, in 1584. This meant her sole surviving son, King Henry III, was the individual on whom the hopes of the Valois dynasty in France now rested. But his marriage had not resulted in any children, and just 8 months after his mother's passing, he was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic, Jacques Clement, who perceived that Henry had made far too many concessions to France's Protestants. With this, the Medici element within the French royal line died out briefly. Indeed, the entire male line of the Valois dynasty that Catherine had married into was at an end. The throne consequently passed to Henry of the House of Bourbon, the Protestant prince that Catherine's daughter Margaret had married back in 1572, right before the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Their marriage had come to mirror its inauspicious beginnings, and they had lived apart for years before Henry succeeded his brother-in-law as King Henry IV of France. They divorced in 1599, by which time Henry had agreed to convert to Roman Catholicism and end the French wars of religion, famously declaring that, quote, "Paris is well worth a mass." But this was not the end of the Medici influence in France. No sooner had Henry IV divorced his Valois Medici bride than he married another Medici. This was Marie de' Medici, a daughter of Francesco de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany back in Italy between 1574 and 1587. In 1587, after his death, Francesco was succeeded by his brother Ferdinando. Ferdinando had been a strong supporter of Henry de Navarre and the House of Bourbon's cause in the French Wars of Religion, bankrolling his war effort and encouraging him to convert to Catholicism to end the religious strife. Now, in 1600, the cost of his support was a royal marriage alliance whereby Henry would marry Ferdinando's niece, Marie. And so it was that, for the second time in little over half a century, a Medici woman became Queen Consort of France. Marie de Medici's marriage to Henry IV, first French king of the House of Bourbon, was facilitated by the fact that a member of the House of Medici, Alessandro di Ottaviano de' Medici, had acted as papal legate or ambassador to France in the late 1590s. Alessandro would subsequently become the fourth and last member of the family elected as Pope in 1605, though his time as head of the Roman Catholic Church was remarkably short, lasting just 27 days in April 1605 before he died. He was 70 years old at the time and had caught a cold during his ecclesiastical coronation. Meanwhile, in France, Marie de Medici would have almost as substantial a life as her cousin Catherine had before her. She gave birth to numerous children. One of these would become King Louis XIII in 1610, after Henry IV was assassinated. In this way, Marie ensured that the House of Medici would form the maternal life of the French royal family down to the time of the French Revolution. That same line claimed the throne of Spain and its empire at the start of the 18th century, while another of her children, her daughter Henrietta Maria, married King Charles I of England, Scotland and Ireland in 1625. Therefore, through Marie, the House of Medici went on to be related tangentially to the rulers of all the major kingdoms of Western Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. Marie's time as Queen of France was one of the last great moments for the House of Medici in Europe. The 17th century, by comparison with the exploits of Cosimo and Lorenzo in the 15th century, or Leo, Clement and Catherine in the 16th century, was an era of decline. It was not the case that the Medici family lost control over Florence and Tuscany. Indeed, they were never more secure in their power there. It was simply that they were fading away from the high politics of Europe. This reflected the general pattern in Italy as a whole. When France and Spain had gone to war back in 1494 to try to become the hegemonic power in the peninsula, they did so because Italy was one of the wealthiest parts of Europe. That all started to change in the 16th century as the economic center of gravity in Europe switched from Mediterranean ports like Venice to North Atlantic ports such as Amsterdam and London. As this happened, Italy declined in relative importance in the politics of Europe. Even the cultural center of gravity was shifting. Leonardo da Vinci spent the last years of his life in France, where he took up a position under the patronage of King Francis I. By the 17th century, the Dutch Republic was the center of European art and culture. As such, it was not that the Medici declined in power in the 17th century. It was simply that Italy became a secondary player in the political, cultural, and economic life of Europe. Florence's reduced status, and that of its rulers, simply reflected this new reality. There were important developments in the story of the House of Medici in Italy in the 17th century. Ferdinando II succeeded as Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1621 and would occupy the position for nearly half a century down to 1670. He was an important figure in the scientific revolution that was sweeping across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. He sought to defend Galileo Galilei when he came under attack from the Church because of the supposedly heretical views contained in his work, notably his advocacy of the heliocentric model of the universe, the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun and that the Earth is consequently not the center of the universe. Having failed to thwart the Church's efforts to suppress Galileo's work, Ferdinando did visit him under house arrest in the 1630s. Later, he patronized the establishment of the Accademia del Cimento, or Academy of Experiment, in Florence in 1657, founded 3 years before the foundation of the more well-known Royal Society in London. These achievements aside, Ferdinando's reign showcased the decline of the House of Medici. After participating in a war for control of the city of Castro in central Italy in the 1640s, the Florentine government was effectively bankrupted. It was a long way from the glory days of the Bank of Medici, when it had bankrolled wars and rulers as far away as England. There was one last major ruler of the House of Medici. When Ferdinando II died in 1670, he was succeeded as Grand Duke of Tuscany by his son, as Cosimo III. Cosimo lived to be an old man and ruled for 53 years. The continuing links between the Medici and the French crown, first fashioned 2 centuries earlier at the start of the Italian Wars, was reaffirmed through his marriage to Marguerite Louise of the House of Orléans, a cousin of King Louis XIV of France. However, in most other respects, Cosimo III was the antithesis of his great forebears of the 15th century, where Cosimo de' Medici and Lorenzo il Magnifico had challenged convention and created a cultural movement within Florence that promoted study of pagan authors and Renaissance art. Cosimo III was a highly conservative ruler, a religious fanatic, and someone who sought to clamp down on prostitution and frivolity in the city. His marriage became troubled, and his wife eventually left to join a convent. They did have children, though over the years these in turn failed to produce heirs, bringing the long-term continuity of the dynasty into doubt. Cosimo is also known for his anti-Semitism, and he expanded the Florentine ghetto that Jews were expected to live within in the city. Finally, for much of the second half of his reign, he became obsessed with having Europe's royal houses styling him as His Royal Highness, a move which signals his belief that the title of Grand Duke effectively constituted a hereditary monarchy. Cosimo died in 1723 at 81 years of age. He was succeeded by his son Gian Gastone. Because of the length of Cosimo III's reign, Gian was already entering his mid-50s when he became Grand Duke. His marriage to Anna Maria Francisca of the House of Saxe-Lauenburg, a senior member of a major German aristocratic line, was organized for political and economic reasons, as she hailed from an immensely wealthy family. It was an unhappy marriage that did not result in children. After the marriage in 1697, the couple often lived apart in Bohemia, modern-day Czechia, where her estates were. He descended into alcoholism, primarily living in Prague. Eventually they returned to Florence, and Gian Gastone became Grand Duke of Tuscany. There their marriage became even more peculiar. Gian Gastone spent much of his days in bed and his nights carousing, where she developed a reputation for talking to their horses in the ducal stables. The marriage indicated how the House of Medici had fallen. It had been entered into to acquire a large dowry and wealth for the Medici, where centuries earlier the family Medici had leveraged their own wealth to marry into the French royal family. When the War of the Spanish Succession broke out in 1701, the Florentines avoided involvement. It would have cost too much. Ultimately, though, it was not their declining wealth that undid the dynasty. It was simple biology. Gian Gastone and Anna Maria's marriage never resulted in children, and with the male line dying out in all the main branches of the House of Medici, when Gian Gastone died in 1737, he was succeeded by Francis of the House of Habsburg, Duke of Lorraine and Bar. Hence, after hundreds of years, the rule of the House of Medici came to an end in Florence. Gian Gastone's death in 1737 had brought the senior line of the House of Medici that had a direct claim to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany to an end. The wider family, though, was still alive and well elsewhere. For instance, at the time that the Medici family lost power in Florence, King Louis XV was ruler of France. He was the great-great-great-grandson of Marie de Medici. In his own way, the new Grand Duke of 1737, Francis of the House of Habsburg, was descended from Francesco I de' Medici, who had ruled in Florence between 1574 and 1587. Junior branches of the family also survived elsewhere as local princes of Italy. The princes of Ottogiano, a small town in the south of Italy not far from Naples, are members of a junior branch of the Medici and continue to hold the title down to the present day. There is also a Veronese line of the Medici who hold the title of Counts of Caprara and Gavardo in northern Italy, not far west of the city of Verona. Tuscany would continue under Habsburg rule for well over a century, though with an interruption during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. The people of the Grand Duchy decided that they wished to join the Kingdom of Sardinia at the end of the Second War of Italian Independence of 1859, and so they became part of the unified Kingdom of Italy, which emerged in 1861. A visitor to Florence today can see the imprint of the Medici family everywhere. While Florence's great cathedral is a testament to the civic pride of the city as a republic in late medieval times, parts of it were patronized by the Medici in the 15th century. Many other buildings around the city were the product of 3 centuries of Medici rule in the city. One of these is the Uffizi building, built by Cosimo I in the 16th century. Today, it is one of the world's great art museums, where the Medici family's art collection is housed. Here, a visitor will pass by works by Botticelli, Donatello, Michelangelo, and many other figures who rose on the back of Medici patronage in the 15th century. Emerging as modest bankers in the 14th century, by the 15th century, Cosimo de' Medici was able to acquire a huge amount of wealth and power. He, perhaps more than any other individual, was responsible for financing the Italian Renaissance, a tradition which his grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, continued. This was the golden age of the House of Medici, when 2 immensely intelligent, cultured, and ruthless men catapulted the family to greatness. Ironically, the family's most tangible period of power came later. It was in the 16th century that the family managed to establish absolute control over Florence and Tuscany, while also claiming the papacy on 4 different occasions. And it wasn't just all the men. 2 Medici women married into the French royal families. Marie de' Medici's descendants would rule France down to the time of the French Revolution. By then, the family's days of ruling Tuscany had come to an end, defeated not by armies or conspiracies, but genetics. As the male line died out, Medici rule ended in Florence. Still, the role of Cosimo and Lorenzo in creating the Renaissance will never be forgotten. What do you think of the House of Medici? Were they a family of ruthless powermongers who did more harm than good in perpetuating the European wars of religion, or should they be celebrated as enlightened rulers who fostered the Italian Renaissance? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.